Welcome to today's webinar, Tactical Urbanism, Taking Short-Term Actions to Generate Long-Term Change, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Tactical Urbanism, Taking Short-Term Actions to Generate Long-Term Change. You can also search for event number 924-7769. I'd like to acknowledge our webinar partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today our speakers are Mike Lydon and Anthony Garcia. Mike Lydon is principal of the Street Plans Collaborative, an internationally recognized planner. He was a co-author of the Smart Growth Manual and the creator and primary author of the reports The Open Streets Project and Tactical Urbanism, Short-Term Action, Long-Term Change, Volumes 1 and 2. He works and speaks internationally on smart growth, livable cities, active transportation, and tactical urbanism. Tony Garcia is a principal of the Street Plans Collaborative. Prior to launching the firm's Miami office, he was project director for 6 years at Chale Cooper and Associates Architects. Between 2008 and 2012, he was managing editor and publisher of transitmiami.com, a blog dedicated to planning and transportation in South Florida. He serves as a part-time faculty at the University of Miami School of Architecture, is an active board member of the Green Mobility Network, and is a member of the Congress of the New Urbanism. Following their presentation, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits, and we've already received a number of them. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as usual, we're going to start with our quick poll. Everybody in the audience, just to see where everybody is from today. You see the 5 options there geographically in the US primarily. We also have international audience. And you can see how to respond if you're in either Canada or Mexico. And we'll leave this open for a few seconds so that folks can respond to it. If you're having trouble responding, you may need to exit from full screen mode. That can be a little quirk of GoToWebinar. And thanks to everybody who's here today. We have a large crowd. And we'll just leave this open maybe another 10 seconds for you to respond, and then I'll share the results and turn it over to Mike. Okay, so today 32% of our audience identifies as being in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 23% in the South, 21% in the West, 20% in the Midwest, and 5% is international. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Lydon. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm just going to pull my screen to full view here. Second. There we go. So this has been an exciting opportunity for Tony and I. You know, we have not co-presented, I think, probably
Hey,
since before.
Mike,
Yes.
please share your screen. You haven't shared it yet.
Oh, I thought I was sharing it already. You're not seeing my screen at all right now?
No, not yet.
I don't have an option here to, let's see, to record.
It's under the
You have to-
sharing tab. You hit show under the sharing tab.
Sharing, I see sharing, yes.
And then, and then on the left side, it says show.
It says, would like to caption. No, that's not letting me show, John. I apologize.
Okay, we're going to switch over to Anthony, and maybe he can go ahead and advance them for you.
Thank you.
Okay, and go full screen, please, Anthony.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. Like I was saying, I've not done this in a while with Tony, so this is really exciting for us to give us a moment to kind of think about the work that we've done together over the last decade or more, and particularly since we were writing the book together back in 2014 and 2015. So Tony, if you'll advance the slide, please. Okay, Tony, you don't have the latest. It's okay, go back. Just wanted to remind everybody, I had one slide that was added to the deck, which was a promotional slide for our book with Island Press. If you are interested in ordering that book, if you do not have it, you can access it at islandpress.org, and you can use the code SMART to save 30%. And so really with that, you know, thinking about the book and thinking about how the practice has evolved is really what we wanted to focus on today and share some of our latest thinking and work as it relates to tactical urbanism, because it's continued to evolve quite a lot since the publishing of the book back in 2015. So street plans, you know, we're a planning and design firm. Next slide, Tony. We do a lot of work from the planning and sort of conceptual design level down into detailed, you know, implementation and technical design work and material standards to the actual implementation of better streets and better public spaces. Next. As it relates to smart growth, really, Tony and I come at this work with a very strong focus on smart growth and walkability and all the good things that come with that. And if you think about some of the challenges where they come from in our world as it relates to street design and land use, you can see that our population since 1950 is doubled, but we have 7 times the VMT. Next slide. Which means more people are driving more often for more things. This has led to an increasing number of traffic crashes and fatalities. We just saw this data come out yesterday that there was more than a 10% increase in fatal crashes since 2020 itself, already a high year in terms of the number of injuries and fatalities. You can see that transportation emissions have now surpassed the power sector in terms of being the #1 offender for emissions across the United States. So when we think about intervening, really we're thinking about transportation as being a key focus of that. And you know, all decisions related to transportation, whether it's at the country scale, the state, the county, or local level, is having a global outcome. And I think we, particularly in the last few years, have seen what that outcome is looking like and have a pretty strong sense of the kinds of work we need to be doing urgently to advance in the planning realm, the transportation realm, what we can do to reduce emissions and keep the Earth from heating further. Next. So primarily, we can't keep building streets and environments that look like this, which lead to the increased crashes, the VMT, the emissions, obviously. This is a major challenge in how we retrofit our communities. So decarbonizing and humanizing our cities is not something that is a big intellectual secret. We've known what we need to do for quite some time now. But part of the challenge is going from a vision and a plan to actually getting something into implementation. Next slide. So when we propose new ideas, typically any change is often viewed as bad change, and it becomes a very strong and challenging political issue that has to be dealt with in the very near term, which can really impact the quality of projects that actually emerge through public and open planning processes. We call this conventional project deliveries, taking that sort of propose and defend approach, which oftentimes is very focused on large scale, very expensive, high stake projects, which really date back to the 40s and 50s as planners started focusing on very large scale investments coming with federal funding. And these processes tend to lack transparency and breed mistrust, which we see play out in the sort of public dialogue in all sorts of ways politically these days, and ultimately leads to projects that are static and inflexible and are very, very expensive. So once built, there's very little changing these types of environments for another 2-3 generations. Next. So Jane Jacobs once said, city planning lacks tactics for building cities that work like cities. And I think what she means by that is when many hands have a role to play in the built environment, in our communities, we get a much better outcome over time. Next. So we really discovered, more than a decade ago that it really is important to give people the experiences of what the future can be. We started with open streets in Miami back in 2008, right there on Flagler Street, sort of the main street in downtown. And we're able to go from planning meetings and charrettes and workshops that might attract 20, 30, 40 of the same folks to be able to invite thousands of people into the streets to experience a different kind of environment, a different kind of way to think about the future of the city. That was back in 2008. Fast forward, and today this street, that same street, Flagler, is now under construction, which is going to be a flexible street that's curbless and can be used for closing it off to motor vehicles and have it be pedestrianized at certain times of the day, then open back up for things like deliveries and local access. So it's amazing to see how a small idea, a weekend event over several months, then was able to generate and encourage the community to go even further to that long-term investment. Next. And that really is, in a nutshell, tactical urbanism. It's an approach to community building using short-term, low-cost, and scalable projects that are intended to catalyze long-term change from the very beginning. So we're always thinking about the long term and how we can get to an outcome that we all aspire to, but don't wait for decades on to receive the infrastructure investments and the funds to do so. We start small and go from there. Next. So this methodology is very iterative, right? You, again, focus on the long-term future that you're aiming for, but test with smaller term projects. And so really the focus so long on the large scale projects has been missing the opportunities to iterate all along the way, physically, in real time, in real places. Next. So over the years, we have generated this methodology, which allows for demonstration projects, 1 day to a month, very, very inexpensive, to pilot projects, which are typically a month to maybe a year or more, really to collect data and information and ongoing feedback from stakeholders, to interim design, which is what we look at from, say, 1 year to 5 years or more, which fills the gap between successful pilots or demonstrations and actually allows you to continue to iterate as you would generate a long-term project or plan in your community, which might last for several generations. And so we've kind of grown used to this as a culture, but until recently, we weren't doing this much in terms of thinking about how we deliver changes to our streets and public spaces. So this versioning idea is something we can look at with a long-term vision like you see on the left, and then sort of reverse engineer that and figure out what can you do with the existing streets, existing places, and quickly create those geometric changes or add those amenities, add the public spaces, and see how they perform and evaluate and use that as a tool to move forward. And so this has a lot of benefits, right? One, it gets the projects on the ground quickly, it allows people to experience them and give their feedback over different time durations. It uncovers what works from sort of a technical operations maintenance perspective, and of course what doesn't. And then ultimately we find that can help build political will and deliver those public benefits generated in the early phases faster. And that's one of our early projects working in Penrith, Australia, which is now permanent as it's gone through those different iterations. So there's a wide variety of applications for tactical urbanism. I won't go through this in great detail, but In terms of advocacy and project instigation, we see a lot of people who might, with or without permission, try to create an awareness to advocate for change in their communities. We see tactical urbanism used as a tool during the planning process to engage people by going out and physically making changes and doing that in public and with public involvement. 3, after a project is completed at the planning level, you can then test some of the projects that are recommended and get that on the ground quickly to kind of continue momentum from the planning process. Tony will speak about this more, but you can use pilot projects as a way to sort of test out the capital design process, which may be funded, but you don't yet have a design for. It can go from the design on the computer screen to design on the street to really help make the long-term investments better informed. 5, you can do materials or even operational testing on streets, bring out the fire truck, test the different kinds of materials that perhaps your community hasn't used before. Tactical urbanism projects are great for trialing those things and evaluating them openly and in real time. Next. There's academic studies we've been a part of that look at things like levels of stress and parasympathetic responses to a change in the environment. So sort of a pre and post analysis on how people respond to the built environment and how changes can be very beneficial and being able to document those. 7, crisis response. Of course, we'll get into that in a few minutes, but whether it's pandemic or natural disasters, tactical urbanism by means of being quick and relatively easy to install projects, it can be really useful to respond to unexpected changes in our lives in a positive way. 8, we can accommodate seasonal need or demand. So oftentimes you see streets that might need to change based on summer versus winter or shoulder season. And so there's ways to kind of install and deinstall projects to meet those seasonal demands. 9, pre-vitalized redevelopment sites. So we do a lot of this type of work where there might be vacant land or unutilized land, and you can add the programmatic element and the physical changes flexibly to start to bring people and to build a market and interest in a particular location within the community. And finally, permits, policies, and program guides, which allow all these things to sustain themselves over time. Next. So speaking of the pandemic and responses, obviously this changed everything in everyone's lives, who I'm sure is joining us today. And what we did see very quickly is that as we were given the guidance to distance from each other, that became very, very challenging, particularly in dense urban environments where there's not a lot of space for people to keep that distance. And so you see there on the right kind of a stunt that was performed in Toronto to make the point that we really needed more space. And lo and behold, communities started to do that very, very quickly. And we started to document it here at Street Plans, all the different types of changes that communities were making. Next slide. Which really boiled down to, in the first couple of months of the pandemic, this set of 6 different changes. As communities were experimenting with giving more space to people, to allowing curbside pickup and drop off, to additional walking space, to getting restaurants out into the street. It was pretty remarkable at a global scale. You could really analyze and look at really just 6 sort of patterns that were being set with how communities were responding to the needs of the pandemic. Next. So with that sort of study and that tracking, we were able to partner with NACDO and the Global Designing Cities Initiative and other partners to develop this guide in the course of about 6 weeks, which was meant to continue to inform communities, particularly city governments, on how they could adapt streets and public spaces for service delivery. It's health services, or next slide, thinking about streets for protests and how streets can be adapted and managed for that, from design and policy and engagement, what some of the design details are, and really over about 15 different ways that streets were and have become used over the last couple of years in a way that maybe was happening in some places, in some ways, in some communities, but not at the scale that it has occurred over the last couple of years. And so really trying to make sure that communities had that level of guidance to think about how to flexibly adapt and use the tactical urbanism methodology to meet their needs. Next. So we really see the sort of the project delivery framework for tactical urbanism is well adapted, or can be adopted for things like a pandemic or other sort of emergency responses. You can see here the very quick to the more lasting and long term. Next. So in total, when we were keeping track of all this stuff globally, and then realized we couldn't keep up with it ourselves, so we partnered with a few other folks to develop a database that is searchable and is mapped and has lots of great outputs that you can you go through yourself, and we found there was more than 400 cities across the globe who made those changes, or 45 countries using those 6 tactics, and with more than almost 1,400 different applications at a global scale. And so it was really hard to imagine early 2020 or late 2019 that this kind of change would occur. But tactical urbanism, that methodology was there and primed and became kind of the go-to to help scale these changes as needed in this global crisis. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it off to Tony, who's going to walk through the evolution of tactical urbanism and share a few case studies. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Mike. I think that really sets up this next part of the presentation quite well. And it was really exciting when Mike and I were talking about how to structure this and just checking in on how we were going to present and think about what's happened over the last 10 years and where it goes from here, and just thinking about that visually and how we would start to kind of map not only our projects, but just the tactical urbanism methodology and movement at large, and bringing together everything that Mike just said about the types of projects, the durations, how they're used, and the different phases of this work as it's developed over the last 10 years. We put together this graphic which talks about, at the one end, initially at the beginning of our firm and even before street plans existed, this sort of discovery of tactical urbanism, even if it wasn't called tactical urbanism. And then, excuse me, that gave way to the sort of introduction of this methodology and the conversion of it from something that was advocacy and guerrilla related into something that was more formally embraced by the planning profession, if not maybe a little bit tepidly at first. And then as the years have gone on, you can really see it be more formally adopted. And that's reflected in both the evolution of our methodology. So at each of these steps, we've developed new tools and figured out how to professionalize our work. Where, I'm going to show you an example in a moment of a project that initially was just kind of going out and doing the work, and then ending with a project that had such an intense level of planning and execution. There's a document or some sort of a structure to every single step. Even though the projects are going fast and they're relatively inexpensive, the structure that we use allows for that speed because it's predictable and efficient. And so it's really just satisfying for us to see this. And I'm gonna jump into just 3 of the major ways I think that we see this work even still used. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do with this presentation was kind of clarify what is tactical urbanism, because I think there's still a good percentage of people, planners, that just think about this as parking day or as a pop-up short-term thing, and it's really so much more than that at this point. And the applications that Mike talked about really point to that. So this first example is from Miami. Some of you may have seen this example. We've talked about this for many years. This is a project in downtown Miami that has taken on several different iterations on Biscayne Boulevard, which is our main street in downtown Miami, apart from Flagler, which is what Mike showed. There are these series of parking lots, and going far back, as far as the early 2000s, there was a plan to pedestrianize this boulevard into more of a pedestrian space rather than what it looks like on the screen here, which is pretty consistent. This is a screenshot from a couple of years ago, but it could have been taken this morning. And so, here's where we're at in downtown, adjacent to Bayfront Park, our major downtown waterfront public space, and tens of thousands of people who are now living in downtown and have been for 10 years, and they have to cross what amounts to, 8 lanes and, several tens of thousands of square feet of parking just to reach this park. And it's no wonder that's very difficult, and that distance physically and mentally keeps people from going to the park. So the story of our intervention there starts in Parking Day in 2011, just testing out this idea, especially in Miami, where it's a relatively conservative political structure. So doing things that are viewed as progressive or guerrilla style It's just not something that you find. And I think that's similar to a lot of cities in the United States, whether, small or large. There's a lot of places that don't fancy themselves New York or San Francisco. And I would consider Miami that. And so this incremental approach where we do like a one-day parking day to kind of get people on board and introduce the materials, and then scale it up to something that looks at this scale, right? This is one of those parking lots. And we got a grant to do this project for $10,000. And most of that money actually went to just pay for the spaces. So the materials and everything that I'm going to show you here happened for about $3 grand, and not including the rental of the space. And this was all laid out in one day, and it was a 1-week test. It was just so phenomenally successful that, at least from our point of view, in the context of what Mike was saying, as something that disrupts people's idea of what something should be, in the same manner as the open streets on Flagler, it was successful. It didn't lead to a longer term action necessarily, or longer term investment, but that wasn't really the point of that one. So that 1-week test led to a larger scale investment by the DDA to really do a larger scale test. And so they went from one week to 1 month, almost 6 years later. So you can see that, the pace of change doesn't necessarily, just because we're able to do these projects in a fast pace does not mean that change follows right away, right? You still have to be patient and put in the political work. And so this was a project that took 7 months to complete, from the moment that we got the notice to proceed until the actual implementation. And our budget for this was $14,000. There was a larger budget, and a lot of that also went to just renting the spaces. But you can see here that it is a methodology that applies to streets as much as public spaces, architecture. I mean, there's so many different applications of tactical urbanism in the built environment. It's one of the reasons I really love this project. And, part of the hook here is programming it during the day, programming it at night, using temporary or found materials. You can see here, these are just tires. But, making it look beautiful is key to the success of this work. It shouldn't just be a bunch of hay bales in the middle of the street. If it's not beautiful, people are not going to get it. They're not going to rally behind it. And that's a really key takeaway, I think, for anybody who wants to do this work moving forward. There's also this data collection component. Part of what you're doing is taking those photos to tell the story. So it's got to be beautiful for the photos, but it's also got to be beautiful so that people go there, right? And then you collect that data, and this is part of your selling point to get more funding later for the permanent project. You say 20,000 people went over 3 weeks. That's huge, where nobody would have gone to this parking lot beforehand. And then also try to leave things behind, like the asphalt art in the images. Some of this furniture is now just degrading in my backyard very slowly. And part of this, and we return back to this subject over and over, this is a political problem. Our streets are political. How we change them is political, because ultimately people have a very strong opinion about how that all works, and they're not afraid of emailing and reaching out to their elected officials. So, this was all, there was a big to-do about it and press conference. And, this was in 2017. So here we are 5 years later, and still nothing has happened, and there is no Biscayne Green permanent. But one can imagine if there were more political leadership and will at the staff level in some of these agencies, that this would continue to move forward, even on a programming basis. So that's a story of Biscayne Green, and it's not all a bad, it's not all bad news. I mean, there is an ongoing planning study. It's not as fast as I would like it to go, but they are working with the state agency, and we've already received questions from this crowd about how to deal with that. So things are moving along, and maybe, in a year we'll see something, or in 5 years I'll be able to give this presentation and show you some amazing, experience on Biscayne Boulevard. And I would attribute the success of that project ultimately to our seeds that we laid back in 2011 to show people that they didn't really need 30 parking spaces. What they needed was better public space. So that's instigating change. That's getting things going. You can use tactical urbanism to get things going, even when you don't know what the next step is. What about when you want to have a next step? What about when you have a capital project coming and you want to plan. And this is a great example of that. And this is a project in Asheville, North Carolina, for a corridor called the Cox Avenue, which is actually now being funded by NCDOT. And we were brought in by a nonprofit that basically wanted to see something great happen with this street. It had bike lanes on it already. They wanted to see improved bike lanes, and didn't want to see the opportunity missed with the capital improvement project. So we saw the Tactical Urbanism project as a way of vetting the designs. And this was a very fast-paced design process. So we got this notice to proceed on, I think, June 1st, and the project was in the ground by November 1st. So that's 5 months for what you'll see is pretty real infrastructure. I mean, it wasn't meant to last that long, even though components of this project are still in the ground today. And I believe this was in 2018. So it's lasted for many, many moons. And everything you're going to see here is $30,000. So I love to bring in the cost component, because it's important to ground the work in how much things actually cost, rather than just say that they're inexpensive. They're inexpensive compared to longer term infrastructure projects. So here's what that looked like. And we, during the design process, we came to the conclusion that they didn't really need a better bike lane, an unprotected bike lane. What they needed were these sidewalk expansions that at times really function as protected bike lanes. And their lanes were very wide. You can see here, even with this outer edge striped, there were very wide lanes, which just encouraged people speeding. And so we had 120 volunteers, and I owe all of that to Asheville on Bikes, who was an amazing partner. And I think for those of you cities looking to do this work, you don't need to struggle with volunteers and those components of the project that are really not second nature to city staff. Look for your nonprofit partners. They're out there. They want to do this work. And if there's funding for them, they're going to do a great job at it. See them as professional partners, even if though they're nonprofit. And part of the project included a huge mural in the middle of a block that we worked with a local artist to develop some sketches. You can see here the sketches that we were given. And then in our asphalt artwork, the work that we do to actually do the implementation, sometimes we're the artists and we do the drawings. I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. This is one where the art inspiration came from an outside source, and then we were able to turn it into something that was implementable on the scale of a street. And so you could see here how we went from this sort of lined just 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper to an actual mural and design that we were able to implement with our volunteers. And here's what that looked like. And really everything that you see on this block, this is $3,000 worth of paint and materials. Understanding that $3,000 gets you a short-term project. And if you spend more money, the more money you spend, the longer that mural is going to last. We also did, measurements. I think evaluation, I'll go back to it over and over, is such a huge part of this work. And so we saw average speeds decline, incidence of speedings decline, and the highest speed lowered by half, which I take to be a huge improvement over the base condition. And we also worked with some partners at State of Place who have a website and an algorithm that sort of quantifies a set of metrics like walkability and the safety of the street, among other things, to come up with some sort of a return on investment. And so often, especially in our more conservative places, the economic argument is the one that wins out. And so the more that you're able to make that economic argument, like, look, your return on investment for every dollar we spend, we put $23 back into the tax base. That's hard to argue versus just keeping the status quo as is and having a safety deficit and also missing out on this, $3 million for the 30 grand that we spent on materials. And ultimately, I mean, I think the success of the project is in the doing the work and experiencing how amazing it is with the community and seeing how they're able to use it and celebrate it. So that's tactical urbanism as part of a planning process. And one hopes with Cox Avenue that project will become something more durable and beautiful with street trees, and that the planning process that they're undergoing right now learns from the test, which all those materials are decaying quite rapidly at this point because it's been so many years. They're the next level up in terms of durability of materials and investment of time and money and political capital is using tactical urbanism to deliver projects. We should be accelerating the delivery of these public benefits. And so this is one in Culver City, California that really relied a lot and still does relies on I think pretty amazing political leadership in the form of former Mayor Alex Fish, current Mayor Daniel Lee, and just an amazing staff that get it. They understand that the economic vitality of their city and the ability of their residents to get around relies on making changes to the public realm. And so part of the inspiration and the genesis of this project actually came from a study that we did with the TRB, the Transportation Resources Board, called Fast Track, which looked at tactical transit projects around the country. I think this was 2018, 2019. And we were really looking at transit projects that were implemented in under 2 years, used temporary materials, and that were either infrastructure or operationally based. And so we issued this report, and soon thereafter, I got a call from the folks at Culver City saying, we want to do this. And so I think, one of the things that we've seen and one of the key takeaways from this work is it's gone from being something that is very small scale, intersection improvements and roundabouts and small things that signage, small things that folks can do, to large scale, long scale projects that impact transit. And transit, for anybody, all of you practitioners and city staff and advocates, transit is expensive. But the more that we're able to use this methodology to apply to transit, and we've seen cities like, Boston and Somerville use this to get to long-term capital, just using cones. I mean, there's been great projects using just cones and paint to create bus lanes, all the way leading to actual physical BRT lines, which take millions of dollars. And so for Culver City, where we are is in that interim design phase. We're just before long-term capital. We're not moving any curb to curb dimensions. And this one was 1 1/3, 1.3 miles approximately. So for context, that Cox Avenue example was just 1/3 of a mile for $30,000 of paint and delineators and whatnot. This was a mile and 1/3 of souped up paint and delineators and street furniture, which I'm going to get into in a minute. We also did, as part of this project, 32 curb extensions, which is, we think, one of the largest asphalt art murals ever to be completed across this city, but I mean, across the world, at almost 32,000 square feet worth of asphalt. And that's all asphalt that some of that was crosswalks, and I'll show you that in a minute, but most of that was actually just curbside space that should be converted into pedestrian space. That is, places that are not parking, that are at the intersections, where you can tighten up the curb radius to create a better condition for people walking and biking. The project involved creating separated bus lanes and bike lanes. And for a project of this scale, I cannot convey to you, and some of you who are in this business know, the speed with which we did this project, from the notice to proceed until when the project was actually in the ground. 1 year for infrastructure of this scale, where we're spending, $1.5 million plus on materials and also contractors to do the work. Because one thing that you'll notice is, as you go from the very short-term temporary stuff to the more permanent infrastructure-based tactical urbanism, you have to go to more durable materials that are not installable by volunteers. So there are components of this project that we did with volunteers, and they were great, but we didn't have volunteers out there spraying MMA and building bus platforms, right? So then also the other hidden piece of this is getting a permit in 6 months for a project of this scale, I think is pretty unheard of and ambitious. to say the least, and we were able to accomplish that. So here are just some of the components of the project. There's a micromobility component with scooters and also these bus platforms that were custom built. We have curb extensions and crosswalks where we use asphalt art. And then there's the transit and the bike lane component that was key to it. So these are physically separated bus lanes. Cars cannot enter the bus lane even if they wanted to, because they're separated by, originally they were separated by wheel stops, and now they're separated by another type of temporary curbing. And then behind the bus stop or behind the bus lane is a physically separated bike lane. And so when we talk about asphalt art, I go back to this. In our work, a lot of it goes back to the fundamentals of architecture and urban design. We draw by hand, we propose and dispose, we do a lot of different sketches to see what works and doesn't work. And so here's just an example of that with regard to the art. This is one where we were the artists. We did all the work here, and it started with just some sketches. These are jacaranda flowers because they have jacaranda trees lining their main street. And so we thought that was a beautiful sort of icon to lay down on the pavement. And there's a larger story here about the curation and development of the art that it did involve the community. But I'm just going to get to the end result. So we go through multiple iterations. This is like architecture school, urban planning school. We do pinups. We do pinups with the community. They tell us what they like, what they don't like. We also consider ease of implementation. How difficult is this work going to be? So you could see on the left, doing the in detailed design of those leaves probably would have been pretty difficult at the scale of 32 curb extensions. So part of what we have to do is really make trade-offs and develop the design and think about how we're actually going to get it done, because ultimately all of that 32,000 square feet worth of asphalt was painted over the course of a week, 5 days. And the broader project took 1 month to complete, which is on the longer end of implementation. Usually our projects take a week or less. As part of that asphalt art development, we do what's called a build manual, which is a 50, 60-page document that has traffic control in it. It has detailed design plans. If we're doing striping as part of it, it'll include striping. And then also colors, templates for our stencils, if we're using stencils. And that's an innovation that I think took us a little while to figure out, that we didn't have to go out and wing some of this stuff. If everything is pre-baked and put into a plan, and we have that plan out with us, it's much easier to direct volunteers and also structure the work. So the plan will include hourly estimates of what the pace of work and where everybody should be doing the work. So that'll be, Mike will be at Main Street and First Street doing a mural and directing 5 volunteers, and Tony will be at the other intersection. And so we're able to plan out with great accuracy, and that's for our benefit and for our clients' benefit as well, so that they know what they're supposed to be doing. So here's what that all looks like. That was a lot of introduction and explanation to get to the meat of it, which is this. Here's part of it. There's just one typical section in downtown, and you can see we took a whole travel lane. This is a classic lane reduction where there was already a center turn lane. So we took the outer 2 lanes in this case, and made bike lanes, bus lanes. And there are locations where the bus lane is broken for right turns, but you can see here all of the asphalt art that's been reclaimed. And so one might imagine in the next step of this project, the city doing a more intense design process for the permanent version, which will have learned from this design. And maybe this becomes a center running bus lane, but at least the curb lines have been set and established, and there's a learning that has occurred because of it. So here's what that looked like before. You see 0% of this curb to curb width of 78 feet is basically for people. It's all for cars, on-street parking and 2 lanes of traffic. And after our work, it became 63% of the space was for people riding their bikes, walking, or taking transit. And that doesn't include the sidewalk space. So this is a huge win and super aggressive and ambitious. I think if any of you do half of this, you'd be successful. Here's another just aerial shot. You can see here, we added in medians. You've got the bus bike platform, and then the asphalt art. Again, part of the reason we do asphalt art is just to reorganize the geometry of intersections that have been made to speed cars along. As I said, we include the community in the implementation of this work. Here, there are people from our team who are reviewing the work, and some of us from street plans will go and do hand drawings. You could see the large jacaranda that folks are drawing right now. That was drawn initially by some of our staff, and then we do kind of a paint by numbers where we tell people what they have to fill in. And we're particular about how things look and maintaining quality control. And if we have to, we move people around if we can. And finally, I think it's important when you do this work to celebrate it. It shouldn't just be once and done, and then you go home and you're exhausted and that's it. Celebrating it from a political point of view is hugely important because you want people to see that it's a success, that there is broad political support and popular support. So they had a ride, and this is a huge to-do that the city did for this investment. Now, returning back to evaluation, just some advice here as you do this work, and I'll explain how we did it on this project. It is so important, especially as you make these really controversial political changes of removing a whole travel lane. You're going to have a good segment of the population that is not in favor of this. Even in the most progressive of places like LA, you still have half of the population up in arms, upset about this. Tesla driving, Bernie Sanders loving people still upset about their commute taking another 2 or 3 minutes. And so all of that to say, you need to have really robust data collection and get apples to apples data, use the same technology before and after, the same timing. If you do it on a Monday morning when school's in session, when it's sunny outside, do it the same after. You want to get really great data sets before and after. And your after data, you really want it to be a few months after the implementation so that people calm down, their travel patterns return to quote unquote normal. And especially now in the pre-COVID, in the post-COVID era, having some pre-COVID data is important. So you can say, here is our project now, here is our project before we implemented it, and here it is in comparison to the pre-COVID times, which was another level of traffic entirely. For this one, we use grid smart cameras, and we also use manual counts. We have had really spotty and not great success with technology in general, not just grid smart, but other technologies. So, that's something that you really want to be careful with in terms of relying too much. But where you are using technology, double check. Make sure that there's some validation process in place so that that those cameras or that device, whatever it is picking up all of the people who are walking and biking, because that's your metric of success. And then identify what those metrics are. Being transparent about this is important. And also, owning up to doesn't work. Owning up to what doesn't work is important. So if the data shows that something's not working, identify what that is, be clear about it, communicate it, and see how you can fix the project moving forward. So we post everything online. Here we have monthly KPI reports. This is just a screenshot of the website. And then what we found so far, and I think, the longer this goes on, the more I trust the data, but in the first few months, it's always so tenuous. We've seen an increase in transit usage, at least from post-COVID levels. Transit usage, which is not a surprise to anybody, is down across the board everywhere from post-COVID levels or from pre-COVID levels, and this project is one of them. And even though we did this dedicated bus lane, so that's not a great data point, but it's reality. We do see increases of up to 85% or even greater of weekday bike volumes, and that's the protected bike lane. When you build those protected bike lanes, people use them. On-time performance for the buses is at 90%. And then interestingly, for a road that had 14,000 cars a day pre-COVID, your travel times in going through downtown are slightly down. And I think I attribute this to people using this street as a cut through to a popular route called Venice Boulevard, which is just a block away. So people are no longer cutting through as much, yet the car volumes are actually flat. So they haven't really increased or decreased all that much. And that just goes to show you, for a street of this size, for a volume of 14,000 cars, you don't need 4 lanes of traffic. And we've done projects of 20,000 cars a day and reduced the car lanes to 2 lanes and had great success. So I'm going to wrap up here and then hand it off again to Mike to close us out. Here are some lessons, just advice from people who we live this and breathe this, and we want to see all of you succeed. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. The first is, I think, lower the barriers to entry. We are the ones who are putting up any barriers, our processes, and COVID taught us that we can do everything that we want to do fast and people will love it. And this is Ocean Drive in the weeks after COVID happened and the lockdown happened. And you would never see this during the day. The city just all of a sudden like put up a bunch of delineators, created a protected bicycle facility, and then about a month after this, they just closed the street entirely to people and opened it up, closed it to cars, and it opened it up to people. And it was one of the most successful projects, I think, anywhere in the country. Unfortunately, they went back on that. So there's a lesson to be learned there, but we can do this. You don't need, there's no special recipe. We're human beings and we have examples of this work from our shared experience throughout civilization, throughout history. We can do this. Ultimately, though, it's a policy decision, right? So that Ocean Drive example is one that didn't stick because there was no policy directive that would live beyond COVID. And I love this. This is a project that we just did in Atlanta during COVID that was meant to test out a shared space concept on Peachtree. And this is the Peachtree that's in downtown, that's in the heart of their commercial district where all the convention center and the hotels are. And I think part of the success of this project and the reason that from our point of view, it was so seamless and easy to do was because they had a policy in place that was accepted by the traffic engineers and accepted by city staff and the planning department, where we could just point at a picture and say, this is what we're going to do. And maybe we did a little bit of variation here and there, but there was a shared acknowledgement that this is a policy that the city wants to engage in and pursue. And so to my mind, and I think this project was hugely successful and popular with the merchants on the street and the business owners and the property owners. Now there's a silver, or not a silver lining, it's a cautionary tale here, which is that streets are and remain very political. And so what happened during that project is, in spite of the fact that they had a political process in place, a policy process, there was a change in leadership. The mayor decided not to run again, and she left, and a new mayor was elected. And one very powerful and well-connected property owner, was able to have the project removed. And this was about a month ago that this happened. So it was really intended to be a 90-day test. It was up for almost a year, 200 and some odd days, and they were already working on the next phase to improve the short-term version. And from one week to the next, they just went in and changed it. And you can see here the quote from this is actually not from the Constitution Journal, it's from another article, but this one property owner, Bowers, had lobbyists at the state level who were threatening the city with ramifications if this wasn't changed back to the way that it was, which was 4 lanes and a center turn lane. And the data showed during our test that traffic was not bad. Emergency response times were actually fine. They were consistent, if not lower than they were before. And pedestrian and bicycle activity were above pre-pandemic levels. This one person wanted this project to go away. This is not the first time that he's exercised this power, his political power. But ultimately, I think you need to make sure that you have the votes in council and that you have the support of your city managers and also the support of the public. And do your due diligence and talk to the people who are most likely to be upset about this and try to get them to come along before anything happens. Another trend that we're seeing, and another just point that we're seeing in terms of funding, we got a lot of questions in advance of the presentation about funding. Look to your MPOs, help your MPOs realize that this is in their wheelhouse. There might be some tricky points there with regard to whether federal funding can be used for materials or planning and how that all works out. But we have so many great MPO partners like the Broward MPO, where we were working with them on on projects at the city level that their role is just to bring people together. They're convening the parties, they're convening the public, the city, they're providing the resources that are needed to get things going. And I think it's really one of the best uses and the best reasons for MPOs to continue to exist and evolve is to help infrastructure get better. And this is one of those ways. And the Broward MPO, I think, does a great job with this. SCAG in California, the Southern California Council of Government, does an amazing job of this, and they've been way ahead. We've also seen this come out of CROG, the Capital Region in New Haven in Connecticut. So, there have been other smaller projects, and this could mean that the MPO has a kit of parts, that they buy materials and loan them out to cities, or that they just convene their consultants and give some funding for materials. But there is a role there, and there's funding there to make positive change at the municipal level. And one of the projects that we actually did with the Broward MPO was recently in Deerfield Beach, where we took a suburban street and really reimagined the geometry of the street intersections. And you can see here just 3 of those examples, those very wide suburban, 30 to 40 foot curb radii became 20 and 15 foot radii, and we reclaimed a lot of space for pedestrians. And one of the questions that we get over and over is, what about MUTCD? And I'll just, I'll say this and try not to be too undiplomatic about it, but there are ways of addressing MUTCD and creating safe streets at the same time. And that is just creatively reinterpreting the decisions, especially as it relates to asphalt art. We know that MUTCD says to stick to earth tones. Those are browns, reds, tans. You can make beautiful designs with any sort of color palette. But ultimately, I don't think that this is an MUTCD issue. I think it's a city engineer issue. The MUTCD is super clear about relying primarily and exclusively on engineering judgment. And so there's a person in your city who is a city engineer, and they're either going to allow this and support it and understand that we can make safe streets, or they don't get it and they want to continue with the status quo and continue to apply MUTCD, even though we see the statistics like Mike showed at the beginning of the presentation. 40,000 people die on our streets every year, and I'm sure MUTCD is not responsible for that, but there's a good amount of responsibility that is at the foot of our engineering profession for just applying standards without thought to context at all. And that's where I think there's an ability to rethink MUTCD and to interpret those guidelines. I'm going to wrap up here in another slide or two here. Be nimble and learn from failure. You're going to fail. It's okay. The whole point of this process to use temporary materials is that things are going to go wrong. This is a project from Hawaii. The city was not able to put in delineators fast enough, and the mural that we created was destroyed within a matter of weeks. And so the learning is, you got to be nimble. You got to be able to get on your toes and get out there and fix things before something goes wrong, especially if you're going to be doing this work. It can't just be status quo. You can't rely on the normal capital improvement plan and wait for a year or 6 months for staff to go in and do something. And then use this methodology to negotiate. So often in our work, we find ourselves up against standards that were written in a vacuum or don't take into account the real lived experience of all of us, of our world. And so this is an example from Burlington when we're developing the bike plan for the city. And rather than sort of try to negotiate over email about what some fire code says about the size of trucks, we did a test, figured out, well, our approach might have been a little bit too aggressive, but the standards also were not realistic at all. And there was a middle ground, and it was done just by doing a test with the actual equipment. And I think there's a lot of this, the spirit of this photo gets at the heart of the testing component of our work. And so I'm going to hand it off to Mike to wrap up.
Thanks, Tony. And I'll be relatively quick, so we can leave about a half hour here for questions and discussion. But I think, moving through the implementation process and thinking about how long you want something to last, what materials and what budget you have in place, and what are your maintenance practices, what's available to you from that perspective, is really critical in sort of aligning a project or developing a project that that really hits your goals and responds to your capacity. So not over designing and not under designing from a materials perspective. And I think getting that right, or very close to right from the outset, by really thinking through all the implications, and as Tony had mentioned, working with DPWs and various agencies and departments to understand that you're trying something new in a new way, and that they're going to need some response and collaboration to help iron out some of the details as you get through the into the implementation phase, is really a critical part of the work. Next slide, Tony. One thing I think we saw during COVID has been so powerful is that streets have all this sort of latent value that we have been covering over by just thinking about streets for moving cars and parking cars. And when you create this type of value that you see here, like if you look at this from an economic standpoint, I'm seeing just local sales tax dollars going at a quick pace into the New York City's coffers. The amount of revenue that can be thrown off from a parking space for dining and sales receipts, if your state has that, far exceeds that of parking a car for $2 an hour, which is what it costs here in the commercial districts in New York City. But when you create that value, what do you do with it, right? How do you leverage that? And I feel like a lot of communities have not taken that step yet. As we're still living with COVID and thinking about the future, how can we leverage these things to be sustained and continue that value proposition for communities, but also then to distribute that value to places that need investment in their streetscapes. And so I think New York City's program, which absolutely kind of took lesson number one to heart, which was just make it easy for people to get out and use the streets for commerce. And this has been attributed to saving 100,000 jobs in the city. We had more than 12,000 restaurants operating on streets and sidewalks, many of them within travel lanes themselves. And I did a quick analysis of all this and saw that there was nearly a 500% increase in revenue to the government through local and state sales tax, which here in New York is split just about 50-50 over the annual revenue thrown off by a parking spot, assuming it's parked 100% of the time. So really, there's a huge amount of value that's created, but then the question is, what do you do with it? I think next slide, San Diego is one of the leaders in thinking about this. And so their Shared Streets and Spaces program has looked at some of the other analysis and sort of data collection that they've done, which I think largely lives in their climate equity index, and realize that they want to help local businesses, but they also know that some businesses have more, have more financial capacity than others. And so how do you have a sliding scale for the permit fee? That's something that they've implemented. And then how do you take the revenue thrown off of that permit structure that's now in place for permanent outdoor dining and reinvest that in opportunity areas that need that support? That's a really, really thoughtful way to think about the value creation and then redistributing that value for investment in the streetscape and public spaces, and while supporting the businesses to use that space. Thank you, Tony. Next. And then, 9, you got to link the tactical urbanism projects eventually to the capital project pipeline. It's one thing to have a successful project, over the course of 6 months or a year, but you're really going to use it as a way to inform and build that pipeline. There's a huge capacity for tactical urbanism to play that role and have that be transparent with the public, having an understanding of what funding is available, what portion of funding is required to go to a 1 to 2 to 3 years, say a 5-year sort of version of a tactical project. What is the replacement cost in terms of the maintenance on, say, delineators or the paint on the ground, and really quantifying how this stuff works and can work at a local level is, I think, really a next step that has to be advanced with cities around the country and the world. And I would just say that I've been so impressed by the work that Paris does and has been doing through COVID and now moving forward, where, you can see from this image when I was there last September, they're already taking their COVID bike lanes, which you see dashed in yellow, and hardening them by making them permanent infrastructure, which is what you see there on the right as a permanent protected bike lane. So they're moving at a speed and a pace where somehow they've linked that short-term investment to being able to move dollars and resources into that design process and implementation really in a matter of months, which is super impressive. And so I'm always interested to see how cities develop their capital processes and how tactical urbanism can fit into that and inform that long-term investment. Next. And I think finally, we learn by doing. We set out to do this work. Even when we were writing the book, the Tactical Urbanism book, we were, only a few projects in and understanding the really fine-grained details and how to execute projects at a high level and at an increasingly large scale. We were just at sort of the cusp of that as we were writing the book, which is largely about the ideas and examples that we've been inspired by and collected and had researched. But now, having incorporated a lot of this in our practice, I think the same principle holds, is that we can read, we can be told something, we can retain some of that information, but I guarantee you, if you go out and do it, and you do that with your community, the impact is tenfold, right? So we really are focusing on the doing part and learning by doing, which we think ultimately results in better streets, better spaces, and of course, a better process in how we deliver projects over the short to long term. So we have a lot of resources available, through tacticalurbanismguide.com or on streetplans.com. You can certainly find a lot of those resources there. I want to close by saying again, the book is available for a 30% discount at islandpress.org. You can enter the code SMART, SMART, all caps, and receive that discount. And I think with that, we will open it up to questions and discussion.
Great, thanks, Mike and Tony. And we'll ask you to turn on your cameras now so folks can see you. And thanks to everybody who submitted a lot of questions. Are you guys okay if we go like 5 to 10 minutes over to like 2:35, 2:40 Eastern?
Sure.
Just given the volume of questions. And again, thanks everybody. And we'll share, if we don't get to everything, we'll share all these materials with them. And you also can see that they have their contact information on the screen, and you can go and contact them directly as well. And they're also on Twitter. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this ahead of time, so maybe I'll start with this. And I know you mentioned this toward the end, but there are a lot of questions that came in, and I'm sure you get this a lot, regarding maintenance of these lanes and bollards, et cetera, et cetera. So, and especially in northern climates where we have some weather issues that are challenging. So is there something that you work with specifically with the communities planning for these things and making sure that they're going to be well maintained over time?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and Tony can chime in. Just being a northerner and dealing with snow quite often with our projects, I think over the years we've seen that some materials don't hold up over the winter months, or they can hold up better if there are maintenance practices that account for their location in the street. And so I think a lot of times we put in delineators or physical elements that are vertical in the street, and then the left hand's not talking to the right in terms of the plow operators go out and just pop them off the street. Now you can either plan in advance for that to happen and have a replacement budget in place, or you can think about how long you want that project to be installed. Is this a one-year thing? Then maybe by month 9 when the winter comes around, you kind of factored in that the plows will take some of the removal into account for you. But you can also think about, well, if it's intended for multiple years, we don't want to be replacing multiple materials multiple times. That's a really good indicator that you should kind of take a step up on the material spectrum and make that investment more intensively upfront to account for that. So that's temporary curbing, the things that Tony had showed a little bit from Culver City can also work in more winter climates. That's thinking about precast concrete, things that can be bolted in the ground but are much more durable. And of course, always coordinating and working in concert with your maintenance teams as it relates to the methods that are being used to plow, where the snow is being stored, and just the general awareness about the new geometries and dynamics that are on the street. That's not easy work, but it's necessary work in terms of making this stuff last a bit longer in a northern climate.
You don't want to add? Okay, we'll just go and get through as many questions as we have time for. So here's a question that comes up in kind of in reference to some of the other webinars we've done recently, and that is, how does equity figure into tactical urbanism?
I can take that one. We've talked so much about this, and I think it comes up in our work so often. Our work is one that is inherently participatory, that involves the creation of infrastructure with people. So it's one that includes the people in a community to create their infrastructure. And so often in our work, we have to pivot. We're asked to do one thing, and then we go and ask questions. And part of what we do at the outset is, even if we're given a project that is already, here's the idea, challenge the staff and also the community, like, is this actually what you need? And connect back the work that we're doing to what people are actually asking for, while acknowledging there's a limitation in terms of our toolkit, right? Like, there are certain things that we can't solve for. A lot of times we'll ask about safety in a community, and the community will tell us we need better lighting and we need to address gang violence in our neighborhoods and our streets. And while those are related to street safety, we can't address those, right? So ours is, what can we do with paint and bollards and that type of infrastructure? So there is a limitation, but I think asking the community about what they need and what they want, and hearing them out and having them lead part of the effort, that's at the heart of really addressing the equity issue, rather than just imposing that decide, announce, defend methodology that Mike was talking about. We run up against that on every single project because it's just so ingrained in the way that cities work. And we try to undo it to the best that we can, but I think we struggle as well. And I'll also say, I think a lot of the COVID response stuff really missed the boat with accessibility. And I talk a lot about this in other presentations, that the outdoor dining was not accessible in general. And that Peachtree example was one where we really made a huge effort to purchase temporary ramps and try to make that space accessible to folks, because we heard from people, the outdoor dining isn't working for us because we can't even get down off of the curb. And then there's also the question of high top tables versus low top. So there has to be some better thought put into, especially with the tactical projects, when you're trying to go fast, still you still have to listen and respond to what people need and be respectful.
So I'll just add to that with, all the planning work that we do. So obviously a lot of our stuff is project-based and geared towards implementation, but a lot of the work we also do, not so much presented on today, is developing, more comprehensive plans, thinking about the network scale, working with, at a citywide level, whether it's a bike and transit plan or a walking master plan or whatever it might be. And in that, looking to the data and to the engagement kind of as equals, engaging citywide, looking at data, where is there the most need, and getting into the places where the need is most pronounced, where the worst health outcomes, where are the most traffic crashes, where is the most systemic disinvestment, where are the places that are vulnerable to displacement in terms of housing investment or gentrification. Like, looking at those factors and then designing a process around trying to ameliorate those outcomes that have been established for decades and decades, and then going and working side by side with the engagement to figure out, to Tony's point, how do we do this, with you in this community? We have a resource, it's a specific pot of money from a specific agency that's focusing on some certain specific issues. So we might not be able to fix the lighting right now, but there are things that you may also need that you can describe to us, and we can help develop a plan for. And so I think a lot of our work in New Haven of late, kind of focuses on that directly. It builds in, it's a bike walk transit plan, and it built in from the very beginning tactical urbanism as a tool to fix the geometry or just respond to some very complicated geometries and street safety issues up front. So we're doing these pilot projects and saying, this is to start a conversation in the 6 priority neighborhoods that need the investment the most and have the worst outcomes from a public health perspective. And then using those pilot projects to engage, get people to give feedback, whether it's negative or positive, and then being to understand, what the process needs to be moving forward once the plan is, the recommendations are created, which we're at that stage now, and then moving right into implementation. We've got resources to go out and actually build some of this infrastructure that responds to those needs. So it's really kind of a data and sort of human inputs that help us get to, the types of designs and projects that are needed most.
Thank you. Next one here is from Scott Sizer, who says, thank you, this is very inspiring. What approaches do you take to finding and working with community partners? And can you speak to the importance and specific roles that they may play in these projects?
Well, that's a good question. I'll start. I think, the projects tend to come to us. I mean, we don't go out and seek projects, but we do find that a fair number of these projects come from community groups. And the ones that I think are the most exciting, the ones that I get the most satisfaction out of working with that team, is one where there is a strong community partner. And it's a mindset issue, I think. And city staff answers to city managers, and there's a political leadership that they have to answer to. So there's a little bit of rigidity. When you have a community partner, the way that they communicate with their neighbors can be different. And that Mike talked a little bit about this. And the communication is so important in the work that we do. So it can't just be an email that's sent from the communications department of a city. Nonprofits and community partners do communication so much better because they come from the community, right? They know how to talk to their neighbors, and they're not bound by certain, regulations or red tape. There's also like flexibility in just rallying people. I think getting people to help. It's different when the community group asks for help versus when the city is asking for free labor. There's a whole attitude shift that happens there. But I think that the best projects are those that are identified by the community because they see the problems on a daily basis versus ones that come from a master plan that was top down, that some consultant came up with somewhere. We often have to go back to the drawing board with those projects and go back to ask the community or the community group, what is it that you actually need?
Yeah, I think between health organizations, bike walk organizations, Safe Street, Families for Safe Street, community groups, those partnerships where they also have the trust and partnership of the city is where we find the most success. So
Yeah,
it's an ecosystem of people who are working towards the same goal. And that's not something that we find in most places. Places where it's aligned, then it's really powerful. And so, yeah, from the local communication to need identification, so really helping to help prioritize where and when and how much is really a key role for local partners with us. And just, I think just having such knowledge of the places where we, drop into for, 12 months at a time or 6 months at a time.
Yeah, right.
And they're going to be the groups that need to be stewarding this and thinking about it long after we're gone. So,
right.
Making sure that the capacity is there, we can help build that capacity, but then that those partnerships can be put into place, over the long term is really critical to the work. So, yeah, I mean, we've worked in probably 6 to 10 communities where that alignment has been there. We've had some of our best outcomes.
Yeah, and I'll add that the other key part of the community group, whether it's an HOA or a nonprofit, is that they're your boots on the ground when you have to defend a controversial project like a lane reduction, or we were just working in Broward County this past weekend with an HOA who's really great and very active. If something happens with that project that they need to defend the curb radii or the material choice, they're going to be out front. They're better out front than the city in a defensive mode, or the consultant. It's not really our role to be out front. So I think you need that partner to help be the sort of referee if you need that, and go to council and speak to council and filter what they hear for public officials.
Thanks, Tony. Next one here is from Robert Stein, who says, does this relate only to reclaiming streets? What about reclaiming a vacant derelict lot and converting it to an attractive space with a farmer's market, for example, in a low-income food desert area?
Yes. I mean, that first example I showed of Biscayne Green was reclaiming a parking lot. And we have other examples of reclaiming old buildings or storefronts. I mean, there's a lot of adaptive reuse is central to the sort of philosophy here. And that can apply to buildings. It could apply to empty lots. We definitely have seen a lot of those examples.
I think a lot of that comes down to the programming. So again, partners are huge, right? What community organizations and businesses and who can you rely on as a partner to help bring that programming to a certain space that may need that love and attention and to build sort of the excitement for it. I think I spoke about this briefly and it's one of those many applications, but our focus is more on streets and public spaces in terms of where the work is, but private land and vacant land is a huge opportunity, and there's a lot of great examples of how tactical urbanism is applied to those places too.
Okay, thank you. Next one is a comment and question from Ed Pettit, who says, there's a perception that tactical urbanism is for yuppie or gentrifying communities to address lifestyle issues like better cycling lanes. What are successful ways that tactical urbanism strategies have been used by lower income communities of color to address environmental justice issues?
I mean, there's a lot of examples of it being used for that purpose. I'll just think of one where we were involved with a ongoing sort of foundation-backed effort in a community called Chester, Pennsylvania, which is just south of Philly. I think per capita, it's usually or has historically been near the top in terms of murder rate, and just had a lot of disinvestment over many, many years. And so this whole initiative was trying to use tactical urbanism in the public realm to do, to do repair on the vacant lots, on vacant buildings, working with local artists who are in the community already, who knew all their neighbors, and could take sort of this investment from the foundation up front and use that as seed capital to really turn the lights back on their main street, to start community farms and provide entrepreneurial opportunities and job opportunities for people in their own community. In those situations, like, I don't need to come in, Tony doesn't need to come in, or firms don't necessarily need to come in and do A, B, and C, but we can give sort of inspiration and access and support the work that was already ongoing. And that's one of the roles that we played there. And it was very much about providing the tools and the resources, but then not necessarily leading in that context, but supporting that work. And the ongoing effort that's continued to be happening in Chester is a great thing to research or look up. Or Tony, you want to talk about Chattanooga or other kind of projects that have been related to the issue, but it's sort of central to that work. And I think it's a perception issue rather than a reality issue on the environmental justice sort of angle with tactical urbanism.
Yeah, I would say that says more about the person who's making the observation not being exposed to the different types of projects. And we just, we don't have the ability to talk about all the different types of projects that we do. And this relates back to the previous question about other project types. But I remember there was one that was not related to streets at all. It was actually a public space in a community called Indiantown in Central Florida that is primarily a farming community, folks from Central and South America who come to Florida to work in the sugarcane plantations and farms. And they just wanted improvements to this public space. And so we worked with them to build infrastructure. I say infrastructure, I'm talking about park benches and signage and just fun toys and games for their kids to use this park, which was just really sort of the only regional asset in a sea of farms. And so that's not something that's going to get a lot of attention or is very high profile, but it's super meaningful and came from a group of people who have no voice. They have no ability to, get six-figure funding from anywhere for major park improvements. There's been a lot of projects like that. And the one that Mike was just talking about from Chattanooga was a mural in the ground. That was one that was more about walkability in a neighborhood that was primarily Central American migrants who live in Chattanooga. And so the iconography of that mural was from their culture, but that came from them. That was a project that they identified that they wanted. And nothing to do with bike lanes or, yuppies and gentrification.
Great, thanks, Tony. Next one here is from Stephen Deal, who says, kind of talking about other types of projects. Do you have any interesting case studies involving tactical urbanism and green infrastructure? It seems like these projects could benefit from the community ownership in long-term maintenance and implementation that this aims to build.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could talk about every project, but this is a good prompt, because one we did not discuss was our Retain Your Rain project in Norfolk, Virginia. For those who know Norfolk, it's one of the most at-risk places in terms of sea level rise. They're getting it from seawater from the bottom, they're getting increased rain events from the top, and really need to become a spongier city. And so with 100 Resilient Cities, that program through Rockefeller back in 2017, we were working with a number of partners in the city to develop a workshop that brought about 60 different people from the most impacted or at-risk neighborhoods to build fluency in how they can build rain gardens and hook up rain barrels and do blue roofs and all sorts of different types of infrastructure at sort of the lot scale that's relatively low cost. And so what we wound up doing was like hooking up rain barrels and developing a couple of rain gardens, really over the course of a few hours. We put all this sort of green infrastructure into place. We got the fire department up on the roof, and they started using their hoses to like simulate a rain event on how fast it would go pre and post, like how fast does it go from down the drain spout into the into the drain system from the building to the street, and then measured that flow, and then we hooked up the rain barrels, and we'd be able to demonstrate how much that slowed the movement of water and the rate of the movement of that water to the drain, so to the stormwater infrastructure. So that was like a really compelling visual demonstration that taught people that, okay, I can get for $400 to get this rain barrel hooked up on my yard. I'm going to start making a difference. And you do that not at the scale of 1 parcel or 3 parcels, but at 3,000 parcels, and you're starting to make a difference, at least when you've got increased rain events, for just that example. And following behind that, one of the recommendations coming out of the workshop was that the city should provide property owners with a grant to help pay for this. So then the city put in place grants up to $2,000 for property owners to access to put in this sort of personal green infrastructure, you could call it. So that's how I think you use tactical urbanism with rainwater and green infrastructure to sort of like over time get to scale. And I believe that program is still in place. And so 4 or 5 years later, we should go back and see how many projects have been funded and implemented, because hopefully it's pretty significant at this point after 5 years.
Thanks. Next question here is from Heather Jaxie, who asks, how do the designs get transferred from the specs to the asphalt?
I mean, there are a lot of drawings that go into creating these projects. And so that's when it comes to bike lanes and crosswalks and anything that happens between the curb lines, it's striping plans. They're the same striping plans that you would use for a permanent project. You still need that level of professional judgment that goes into creating those drawings to create temporary infrastructure, at least anything over a day or a weekend. I think you can get away with lighter conceptual design for very short-term things. But if you're starting to spend 30, 40, 50 grand, you need to have some sort of a drawing that's approved by folks, whether it's an informal permit process or something more formal, to allow that to happen. So there's a striping plan. There's also a schedule for your build for what the day is. There's a budget, which is just a spreadsheet that tells you what each element is and how much it costs. That's how we guide our purchasing plan. And then there's also on the back end, sort of a removal plan and a maintenance plan. What's going to happen if folks want it removed, if it's supposed to be very temporary and it's served its purpose? Who's removing it? How much is that going to cost? And who does that? And these are all just documents. It's written down. It's either a drawing or some sort of a spreadsheet that explains the order of operations.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Joanne Phoebe, who asks, have you ever worked with the jurisdiction to evaluate their permitting process to find ways to remove roadblocks or streamline approvals so that the process for communities to implement open streets can be made easier and faster?
Yeah, we've worked in a few communities. Burlington is one where we helped develop a demonstration project guide. Now that wasn't really for long-lasting projects, but like to provide an outlet for a very engaged community with very strong advocacy organizations that would allow them the ability to go and test things themselves or alongside the city, I would say. So kind of designing that process required, basically it was like 4 hours in, Burlington's Public Works Department with the PD, the fire department, Public Works, the planners, the advocates, the, ARP, the funders, like everyone was in the same room. And we just kind of designed a process that met the minimal specs of life and health and safety for different agencies and departments, like what they really wanted to make sure was put into place. And that permit has been used both by the city and by advocates there. We worked in Thessaloniki, Greece to develop a process about public space, on how to co-design public space and to streamline that process in the city to get citizen engagement increased. That was identified as one of the challenges there to kind of social cohesion, was that people didn't really have an outlet to make changes or to program the existing public spaces. So we've kind of worked on issues like that through guidance and policy. There's several others. There's many cities now. I saw the other day from a small town in Georgia, I believe, has their own sort of tactical urbanism program. So there's many examples out there that can be looked to as a way to kind of support from a policy perspective, but also programmatically and process-wise put into place ways to get those permits and to make sure that people are able to do that and quickly.
Thank you. Next one here is from Colin Brown, who says, national traffic violence data released just this week showed the highest levels of fatalities in 16 years. that's continuing a trend in the US. How do we best push public officials to prioritize tactical urbanism as an immediate safety intervention?
That's a great question. I think you have to think about this as like tactical urbanism is like the first mover here. It's like how you kind of set the geometry of a safer street. And I think we've seen good results in terms of speeding, in terms of lower crash rates in some projects. But ultimately, I fear that a lot of those are being canceled out by the increased size of vehicles. So when there are collisions, they're more severe, that more people have been driving during the pandemic. There's some other trends or counter trends, I should say, which are very difficult to solve for using tactical urbanism alone. That's just the reality of it. But on an individual street or corridor or intersection basis, I think, if you're not moving quickly and anticipating or responding to places with a crash history, the same engineering departments or people who sign off, on the development of the infrastructure, who also say no to, in many events to the tactical urbanism projects, they're responsible for both. So
Right.
what is the big idea, to increase safety in the near term? Because if you don't, people are just going to keep getting hit and keep getting killed. And we see it over and over and over and over. So, I think tactical urbanism has a role, but there's a lot of larger systemic barriers that, need to be moved aside, to, I think, over the long term, get closer to this vision of, zero traffic fatalities, or getting close to that. And we're a long, long way from that in the US.
Yeah, or moving away from it.
Understood. And we just recently did a webinar with Angie Schmidt on her right-of-way book, so folks can look at that in the archives as well. That issue was the subject of that program. Next one here is from Armand Bryant, who asks, I heard you talk about getting buy-in from the city council and city staff, but what about local business owners? Do you get their buy-in first, or do you just do your project and then get the feedback?
No, you can't just go and do the project. And this goes back to the equity conversation and the communication. The best thing to do is to go door to door, especially if you're doing something on a main street or where there's a commercial presence. Go talk to them. Mike and I will go talk to people. They have to see our face. They have to know who we are. They cannot just be introduced to the project when you show up and remove their parking or change their parking from angled to parallel. That does not go over well. I mean, as you can imagine, that's never going to go over well. So definitely, it all goes hand in hand. Getting your political leadership to get behind you, they're going to want to know, did you talk to, Joe from the sub shop? If you're going to change his parking, have you talked to him? If they're a good elected official, they're going to ask that. And so there's a communication sort of chain here that goes from the community to the elected officials to you. And you've got to play your part. So that's going door to door, talking to residents. Even if they're not going to support you, they're going to respect the fact that you went to them. Because what you can't do is rely on the mass email from the city. That's fine. That needs to happen so that we check that box. But that can't be the way that you communicate with the community. There has to be more personal and just human interaction. We communicate by seeing each other's faces, and there's an authenticity that goes along with that. And what you're trying to do ultimately, especially with some of the more controversial projects, is convince people. This is it's about selling your project. Sell the project, and you can't sell the project by keeping people at arm's length. You have to meet them where they are and have those uncomfortable conversations, even when you know that they're going to disagree with you. It's much better than getting a nasty email later. And put people on the spot. We let people off the hook too often, sending really mean emails, but we give them a space to do that because they don't know who we are as people. So if they know who you are and you've talked to them about things outside of the project and you form a personal relationship, which is not impossible, but it's very difficult to do on every project. I realize that, but that's the hard work that you need to go through. And you and people and staff know who are the people that are constantly emailing. You need to make friends with those people. You need to talk to them, get to know them, make it so that it's difficult for them to get really upset at you at a personal level, as impossible as that may sound.
I also just said this really relates to the communication strategy, like how you position and talk about a project, right from the jump, right? If you're talking to a business owner and you tell them this is for 5 weeks, right? What's the most important thing we have to take into account for the next 5 weeks, right? Well, there's always a street festival that happens, creates a huge revenue stream for me. People can't get here. I'm concerned about that. Okay, let's talk about that issue and say design and plan and have operations that support those concerns and needs. And you need to think about like de-risking it around, expected duration and like the materiality, be able to explain and show pictures to people in person, say, this is what this is going to be. And we're here to get your feedback on this. And then we're going to remove it, or we're going to tweak it or change it. And they know there's a level of flexibility there where they may not trust it or think, well, that's not going to work. But at least they know there's an outlet for the project and how they can change. If it's not successful, they can point to you and say, see, you were wrong, Mr. Designer, planner guy, you were wrong, and I was right. And if that actually comes to fruition, you have to own up to that and say, you know what, you're right, this didn't work very well, and move on. And then the second piece of that strategy is think about how you can kind of step back. If like you're thinking about doing this project, it's a pilot, or it's going to be interim design, it's there for many, many months. Maybe you need to start with an event, right? Start with a weekend-long project. Bring 50 people in front of this person's store, have them like see the value proposition or the trade-off from, say, losing a couple parking spaces to gaining the public space with the programming that actually supports their bottom line. If they can see that and experience it, it's going to help you get to the longer-term project faster. So sometimes don't be afraid to kind of scale back what your ambition is, what you want to do, and try something at even shorter duration to kind of show rather than tell. And that can often be a strategy to think about to getting towards, a better lasting outcome.
Great, thanks, Mike. We'll ask a couple more here before we go to closing thoughts. Next one here is from Kevin Strickland, who says, do you have any experiences with businesses adopting a portion of a bike lane? Houston businesses in particular are obsessed with parking, and the bike lanes get a lot of pushback.
Businesses adopting from what sense? Like actually just supporting it?
They're concerned about losing their parking, and so they don't necessarily support these projects.
I think it kind of just goes back to what we just discussed. Yeah, that's a great opportunity to say, let's try something for a weekend or a week, and let's document and collect the data and how much parking do you need, how much parking is used, what's the supply, have those conversations openly by using the project itself as the way to have that conversation. Not in the abstract, but in the real world.
Yeah, right. And with data, that's the other part. What they care about is money. So if you say, okay, put your money where your mouth is, and let's see your year-on-year revenue from this same weekend or this same month last year, and then have a conversation that's grounded in reality instead of hyperbole and fantasy. Like what you're afraid of is not the same thing as what reality is.
Again, I think you need to think about the design strategies too. So oftentimes there's ways to think about if you're removing or reconfiguring parking from one place, you can gain it and add it back in another. We're currently working on a project where a street is going from 2-way to 1-way, and what that's going to allow for is actually a net gain of on-street parking for a business that's going to lose 6 spaces in front of their grocery store that's being turned back into the historic public space that it was. By walking through, here's your loading zone that stays where it is for the trucks who service the business. Here's where we've added some parking on street. Here's where we're seeing the majority of your customers are arriving by foot. We did a survey. Also, like those tools start to de-risk the situation for the business owner.
Okay, just a couple more here. Question from Rachel Peterson is there a difference between tactical urbanism and demonstration projects?
Demonstration projects are part of tactical urbanism. They're one of the sort of buckets of projects, and largely their value is for engagement, conversation, again, over a weekend, over a week, not necessarily for representative data collection. Really trying to pull out the performance data comes from projects that last many months, multiple seasons, a year or longer. So demonstrations are very much part of the toolkit for tactical urbanism, but just one type of project.
We see a lot of entities, agencies, municipalities misuse or just call everything tactical urbanism a demonstration project, which is just part of the confusion. It is on the more shorter term end of that spectrum.
Excellent, thank you. So just looking at where we are in the time, we could obviously go probably another half an hour or more, maybe 45 minutes going through all the other questions. But since we are over time, I think we'll cut off the questions here. But I did want to give Tony and Mike a chance to give us some kind of closing thoughts and takeaways from what we heard today. And why don't we start with Tony?
You know, I'm just excited to see where else this methodology goes and to see municipalities continue to adopt it and to enable citizens to do this work. I think we have so much cynicism and distrust in government, and this is one of the ways that I think we can help like ease that conversation and make it better and show people that there is a way, a real transparent, flexible way for them to be involved in the civic process in our society without getting upset about things. And we're going to need it. I mean, the amount of NIMBYism that goes on for public housing and or for housing in general, and for transportation changes, and the type of transportation changes that we're going to need to do to address the climate catastrophe that's coming and all of the societal changes that are coming. I think this is a methodology that's set up for this. It's just a matter of having it more widely adopted.
Yeah, I'll just share, I'm sorry for the fumbling of the presentation at the outset here, but I think it's been really good to kind of think about this moment and think about how the methodology continues to adapt. No one saw COVID coming. I think we were, impressed and, humbled by a number of communities who are able to look to this sort of concept or this method and, move extremely quickly and provide an element of health, of, both mental health and physical health, having access back to streets and public spaces again, to support businesses, to get people outdoors at a really, really, really tough time. And there's so much value in responding to that crisis with this tool, but I think there's so much value for this, as Tony mentioned, for the long haul. And so we're nowhere near where we want to be in terms of embedding this methodology as something that's not appropriate for everything everywhere, of course, but can be used in certain situations, in certain moments, to really help move the needle on safer, more accessible communities. And so I think with that, we're looking towards the next work for us in terms of the guidance we've always provided, and that's looking at some version of updating the book from 2015 with a lot more information that's more relevant and current to how this methodology has evolved. And then also thinking about the design guide for materials that we put together back in 2017 with the Knight Foundation. That could use a real strong update as well. So we're looking at that with Island Press and how we might be able to come up with a new resource moving forward that's more current and can support the needs of planning departments and advocates and engineers and all the folks who've been on this call today. So thanks for tuning in today, and please reach out with additional questions. Be happy to talk to you at a later time.
Yeah,
Great, thanks, Mike and Tony. And you can see their contact information on the screen there, and we will share all the questions that came in. With that, we're going to conclude our webinar today, Tactical Urbanism, Taking Short-Term Actions to Generate Long-Term Change. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Mike and Anthony for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology expert, who helps to make this all happen every time we do it. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including information that just went out during this program on our next program, which is Designing Roundabouts to Support Walkability and Smart Growth with Dan Burden of Blue Zones, which will be Thursday, May 26th. And then The Past, Present, and Future of Electric Bicycling with Carlton Reed, Dylan Fitch, and Andrew Brown, which will be held on Thursday, June 23rd. With that, I wish everyone a great day, and thanks for joining us.